The official record said 51 children had died at the school. 51 names. 51 deaths. Documented, filed, counted. The official record had been the official record for decades. Nobody disputed it. Nobody looked further. The file said 51, and the file was the file. In May 2021, a woman named Sarah Beaulieu walked across a field in Kamloops, British Columbia, pushing a machine called a ground-penetrating radar across the ground. The machine sends signals into the earth. The signals bounce back differently depending on what they hit. You can detect disturbances in the soil from 100 years ago, things that were placed in the ground, things that were never supposed to be found. The machine found approximately 200 anomalies in the soil, potential burial sites, children-sized. The official record said 51. The ground said something else. The gap between those two numbers is not an administrative error. It is not a clerical oversight or recording failure. It is a decision. Someone decided what would be filed and what would not. Someone decided which deaths would be counted and which deaths would be covered over with soil on a school's grounds and forgotten. The gap between 51 and 200 is not a mistake in a spreadsheet. It is the buried record made visible. To understand what the ground found in Kamloops, you have to understand what the Kamloops Indian Residential School was. It opened in 1890 as the Kamloops Industrial School on the unceded ancestral territory of the Secwépemc people in southern British Columbia. It was run by the Roman Catholic Oblates of Mary Immaculate and the Sisters of St. Anne. From 1890 until the federal government took over operations in 1969, and then until the school finally closed in 1978. It was the largest Indian residential school in Canada. At its peak in the 1950s, approximately 500 students attended the school. Children from over 100 Indigenous communities and at least 38 different nations across British Columbia and beyond. Children as young as 3 years old. The official purpose of the school was education. The actual purpose, stated clearly in the government policy that created it, was assimilation. The instruction given to the system by Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs, was direct. Scott said the goal was, in his words, to get rid of the Indian problem. This was the language used by a senior government official. Not a fringe position, not a private sentiment, a stated policy objective of the Canadian government. To achieve this goal, children were taken from their families, sometimes with the family's reluctant agreement, sometimes by force. Once at the school, they were forbidden from speaking their languages, forbidden from practicing their cultures or spiritualities, forbidden, in many cases, from speaking to siblings who attended the same school. They were given new names. They were given new identities. They were told in various ways that everything they had been before they arrived was wrong. Before the late 1950s, the children at Kamloops spent half of each day on religious instruction and performing physical labor that contributed financially to the school's operation. They spent half a day or less receiving basic academic instruction. The curriculum was not designed to give them a future. It was designed to give them a different past. In 1907, 14 years after Kamloops became an Indian residential school, a doctor named Peter Henderson Bryce arrived to inspect the schools. Bryce was the chief medical officer for the Federal Department of Indian Affairs. He was not an activist. He was not a critic of the system. He was a government official, doing a government job. He visited 35 residential schools across Manitoba and the Northwest Territories, and he wrote down what he found. What he found was this: of a total of 1,537 students reported across the schools he surveyed, 24% were dead. At one school, the File Hills Colony Residential School in Saskatchewan, 69% of students who had attended were dead. The cause, in nearly every case, tuberculosis, 24% dead. In some schools, only 31% of children survived to graduation. Bryce understood the cause precisely. The schools were overcrowded. Ventilation was inadequate. Sick children were not separated from healthy ones. He knew that tuberculosis was not an inevitability. Canadian cities had already cut their tuberculosis death rates by as much as 75% by improving ventilation and sanitation. He wrote in his report, "There is nothing intrinsic about the Indigenous children's predicament. If conditions were different, outcomes would be too." He submitted his report to the Department of Indian Affairs in 1907. The report detailed the conditions. It named the schools. It gave the death rates. It recommended specific reforms. He believed that once he proved the problem and gave them a solution, the government of Canada would do the right thing. How could anyone allow these kids to die? The Department of Indian Affairs buried the report. They did not publish it. They did not implement the recommendations. Duncan Campbell Scott suspended funding for Bryce's research. He blocked Bryce's presentations at academic conferences. When Bryce continued to file annual reports documenting child mortality, Scott terminated the practice entirely, and then claimed in writing that Bryce had not actually been employed by the department since 1908, a lie which Bryce called transparent hypocrisy. The report was leaked to the press. On November 15, 1907, the Ottawa Evening Citizen ran it on the front page. The headline read, "Schools Aid White Plague, Startling Death, Rolls Revealed Among Indians." The public knew. The government knew. The schools stayed open. Bryce spent 15 years trying to be heard. In 1922, he self-published his findings in a pamphlet he called "The Story of a National Crime," an appeal for justice to the Indians of Canada. He was by then retired and largely ignored. He died in 1932. The residential school system continued operating for another 64 years after his death. A doctor filed a report in 1907. The report was buried. The children kept dying. The file said nothing. The Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc, the First Nation whose territory holds the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, had always known. Not as an administrative conclusion, not from a file, as a community, as a knowing passed from generation to generation through oral history, through the testimony of survivors, through the specific and particular grief of families who sent children to the school and did not always get them back. Chief Harvey McLeod of the Upper Nicola Band attended the Kamloops School as a child. He said, "I just remember that they were here one day and they were gone the next." That was the experience of disappearance. Not death reported, not remains returned, not families notified. One day present, the next day gone, and nobody spoke of it again. When children died at the school, their bodies were not consistently returned to their families. Their families were not always informed. The circumstances of their deaths were often not recorded with any specificity. The school's own documentation, when it existed at all, frequently recorded only the barest minimum: a name, a date, sometimes a cause, sometimes nothing. Chief Casimir of the Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc described what the community had carried for generations. We had a knowing in our community that we were able to verify. To our knowledge, these missing children are undocumented deaths. A knowing that was spoken about but never documented. That phrase is important. Spoken about but never documented. The community had been saying this for decades. The survivors had been saying this. The elders had been saying this. But the file said 51. And the file was the file, and the knowing of a community. The oral record, the living testimony, the grief carried in families, was not the file. And for a long time, the file was all that counted. In 2021, with access to ground-penetrating radar technology, the nation hired Dr. Sarah Beaulieu of the University of the Fraser Valley to complete a survey. The search was overseen by the nation's Language and Culture Department. ensuring it was conducted in a culturally appropriate and respectful way. The machine found what the community had always known was there. On May 27th, 2021, Chief Casimir of the Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc issued a statement. She described what the radar had found. She said, "It is with a heavy heart that I confirm an unthinkable loss that was spoken about but never documented. The preliminary findings indicated approximately 215 potential burial sites on the school grounds." The Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc later clarified that figure to approximately 200 potential sites as the analysis continued. The exact number remained under investigation. The nature of what had been found was not in doubt. The survey had covered less than 2 acres of the school's 160-acre site, less than 2 acres of 160. The rest of the grounds had not been surveyed. The national and international reaction was immediate. Flags were lowered to half-mast across Canada. Outside the Vancouver Art Gallery, people placed 215 pairs of children's shoes on the steps. Across the country, communities held vigils. In the days that followed, First Nations across Canada began requesting their own ground-penetrating radar surveys. One after another, communities began looking at the ground near their own former residential schools. As of the most recent available documentation, First Nations across Canada have located evidence of the remains of more than 2,300 children in suspected unmarked graves at or near former residential schools and Indian hospitals. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had previously documented at least 3,200 children known to have died in the residential school system overall. TRC Chairman Murray Sinclair estimated the true number could be between 6,000 and 25,000. A national accounting, still incomplete, of a burial record that was never kept. Chief Casimir, when she announced the Kamloops findings, made one specific and direct request of the federal government and the Catholic Church. She asked them to open their student attendance records immediately and fully. She needed those records to try to identify who was buried there. The records have not been fully released. This is how the buried record works in practice. A child enters a school. A file is created, the child gets sick. The child dies. A minimal entry may or may not be made. The body is placed in the ground near the school. The family receives no notification, or a vague one, or a false one. The file records 51 deaths. The ground holds 200. And then 80 or 90 or 100 years later, a community asks for the full file, the attendance records, the correspondence, the health records, the burial registers, and the file is not fully available. Some records were destroyed. Some were never kept. Some are held by institutions that have not released them. Some simply do not exist because nobody considered the lives of these children worth fully documenting. The file said 51. The ground said 200. The gap between those two numbers is 114 years of a decision not to look. There is a detail in the Kamloops story that I have not been able to leave behind since I first encountered it. When Chief Casimir announced the findings, she was asked about the children found in the ground. She said her community would caretake for these lost children. Not investigate, not process. Caretake. The word is a choice. A community that was not responsible for these deaths, whose children these were, whose loss this was, chose the word caretake for children the institution had buried without their families knowing. The institution filed 51 deaths. The community care took approximately 200 children the institution chose not to file. That gap between filing and caretaking is the entire history. Peter Henderson Bryce wrote a report in 1907. He gave it to the government. He expected the government to act. He said, "How could anyone allow these kids to die? the report was buried. Bryce spent the rest of his life trying to be heard. He died in 1932. He is not a household name. The Tk'emlúps de Secwépemc have been saying this for generations. They had a knowing they could not prove to institutions that required proof in the form of a file. In 2021, a machine walked across the ground and made the knowing visible. The file could no longer say 51 and be believed. Some children are not missing. They are misfiled. And some children were never filed at all. The ground held them. The community remembered them. And eventually the machine confirmed what the community had always known. The file is still open. In this case, more than most, it is not yet finished being written. This is the buried record. Subscribe to follow the archive. The next file is already open.